Trudy and I worked to host the first Kauai Land and Arts Festival, many such festivals that Trudy's been involved in. And that day, when I heard her speak, she sang, she cried, she proclaimed, she beseeched, she encouraged, she laughed. And I'm going to tell you, get ready for any of that array and more of emotions as she comes so passionately to this cause. Thank you, Trudy, for all that you've been doing.
But Anne helped Paul pack up his books. And then she wrote this incredible book called Witnesses to the Struggle. And it talks about Paul and Dorothea and Carrie McWilliams. And Ernesto's not in here. I forget, my brain just went dead. But anyway, the woman who wrote this book is really wonderful. And she's really adept at catching the history of things. So here's to Anne Loftus, her spirit. A little story. When I moved to Long Island and I came back, shortly after I came back, while I was hanging out in Dean's shop, we went to a labor conference in Stockton. And there at the table is Anne Loftus. And so I go up to Anne and I squat down next to her and I say, "Anne, do you remember me?" And she says, "Trudy, I remember you." I said, "Oh yes, so good to see you. I remember Paul." And she says, "Not a day goes by I don't think of him." That's the kind of person he was. And I'm going to try and give you some of that breadth spirit of who Paul was tonight. Paul stole my line about you being an especially important audience to me. Between the Visalia Quakers and this congregation, I have had the only positive response to bringing the message about the importance of land to this valley. And if it hadn't been for you people, everybody in this room, I'd have given up. So if you think about tenacity, you can contribute some of that to yourself. Because you never say no when I call you either. So I'm going to pretty much read most of this. Hopefully I've written it at a decent tongue. Because I don't trust myself to ad-lib, and you can tell why now already. What I've committed to talk about is Paul Taylor's baton. But before we go any further, how's the sound of this? Is it too echoey? Is it all good? Good? Okay. So I've committed to talk about Paul Taylor's baton and what we might do with it here and now in the Valley. I'm going to talk about my experience with Paul and the piece of research I picked up in his office and my attempts to bring his message here to people in the Valley. At the end, I hope to offer some tools that others might be able to use as we continue in the struggle, and maybe even win a few rounds, okay? I think there's a faith component in this larger story of the struggle that the other speakers haven't mentioned. It's not an easy thing for me to talk about. I grew up in an agnostic household, and I was raised to be suspicious of people who talked about God. I still find it difficult to make proclamations about God's existence or pretend to know how and where the Spirit moves. But since I left Davis in 1993 and moved down into the Valley, I have sought and found a way of listening to that of God in myself and others. And that's a Quaker framework. I've also worked to understand the biblical teachings about land, something referred to as land theology by some, and I've tried to interest others in this aspect of our large religious inheritance. In a huge way, both the land theology and this personal faith have helped me carry on as well, and I think that they could aid more of us if we realize that there is a faith component to this work. To put it simply, Paul Taylor's baton was land. Dan O'Connell, in his presentation 4 weeks ago, spoke about Paul's devotion to the acreage limitation provisions of federal reclamation law. And it's true that that was the issue he took on, promoted, and defended the last 30-some years of his life. But the reason that issue meant so much to him was that it was a national recognition of the importance of land, the critical importance of a stable, evenly distributed pattern of land tenure to people as equal individuals, to the health and welfare of communities, to our political stability as a democracy, and to the prevention of war. He also understood exactly that in California, water is the key to land, and that the acreage limitation provisions, by controlling the amount of water any individual could receive, those were a guard against monopolization of land as well as water. I want to tell you a little bit about how I met Paul, because I now see with 2020 hindsight that grace had a large hand in bringing me into this fray. I can still see exactly where I was when I first noticed him, before I knew who he was. I was walking down Euclid Avenue in the Berkeley Hills with my boyfriend on an early autumn Sunday morning. There was an old man walking up Euclid on the other side of the street, going slow. As we passed him, I could see his eyelids were taped up with surgical tape. It's almost a hallmark of him now. And he walked with a cane. I felt a pang as we passed him, recognizing a solitariness that could have been lonely, and I did not forget him. About 2 months later, in November, I think, I noticed a flyer amidst the billion flyers that papered Berkeley's telephone poles, fences, and walls, and it was for a talk on California water. I decided to go to it, having been a water freak all my life. And I should mention right here that at that moment I had no idea what I was doing in Berkeley. No idea. Other than I was trying to get into the university so I could study environmental problems somehow. When I got to that talk, it was Paul Taylor giving the presentation, that old man that I'd seen on the sidewalk a couple of months before. As he spoke, I became in awe of him, admiring the work he'd done, the way he intended to preserve something I imagined was already lost. I waited in line afterward to shake his hand and thank him for his work. And then I ran to the Ag Library, where I had checkout privileges, and found the only book with his name on it, which was American Exodus. See, I did bring that. Yep. The first author was someone named Dorothea Lange, which irritated me somewhat until I got the book home and read it cover to cover that night. This book changed my life. Okay. About 8 months later, I do not want to spill that down. About 8 months later, I enrolled in a summer session taking a meteorology class and one on agricultural co-ops, I think. I was sitting on a bench on the north side of campus near the Earth Sciences building, and I was studying for my meteorology midterm when I saw Dr. Taylor walking down the broad sidewalk. I thought a minute about just letting him pass, but then I jumped up, just in time, thinking I'd just say hello and thank him again. But instead he said, "Come with me to my office." And so I grabbed my books and I jammed them in my backpack and strolled slowly across the campus with him, with my arm tucked into his. When we reached his office, he set down his briefcase and he turned to me and he said, "Do you know my wife, Dorothea Lange?" And it was present tense, not past. She'd died 10 years before, but he still thought of her in present tense. "Do you know my wife, Dorothea Lange?" And I said, "No." And so he proceeded to bring out some photographs and some papers and some articles on her, and he was trying to introduce me to her. And then I realized it was way past time for my midterm to start, and it was all the way across the other side of the campus, so I raced to the other side, jumped in the chair, took the test, and aced it, because I was higher than a kite. So the next summer, I was enrolled in my second summer session, and I was working part-time as a domestic for some lovely people named Ted and Shirley Strashinsky, and it's the hardest name to say. They had two beautiful children, Mark and Maria, and I adored them. Ted was a photographer, and just a matter of fact, he happened to be the photographer who took the photographs on the UFW boycott for John Dunn's book, Delano. I didn't know anything about this. Shirley was a freelance writer, and she worked while I looked after the kids and did the ironing, little stuff like that. One afternoon, she went to interview Paul, and when she came back, she was in awe. And when I told her about my brief encounters with him, she said, "Shirley, without blinking an eye, you should go work with him." At that point in my life, I didn't know a person could do that any more than I knew about the UFW boycott. But from that moment on, I was moving toward his office and the idea of apprenticing myself to his work. I tell you these things because I understood them then as miracles at the time they happened, not just in retrospect. I can still see clearly in my mind's eye each incident I just told you. It was sharp as it is, still sharp, and it's been 40 years. Later in my life, when I heard the definition of grace from the Okie poet Wilma McDaniel, and grace, according to the concise Wilma, by the way, is unmerited favors. And once I'd gotten over the Protestant shock of that, it wasn't hard to see that each of these events, these episodes, were grace notes. And to come to view my whole history as a sort of gentle recruitment. And now, after learning the theological component of this struggle, of it going all the way back to Isaiah, I kind of enjoy the thought that maybe I've been recruited by Yahweh, him or her or itself. What I want to do now is read a presentation on Paul that I gave at the 1993 California Studies Conference as I prepared to leave academia. It's kind of a swan song, and I was ready to leave academia for all its stuffy insistence that all this stuff isn't important anymore. And I gave it to them with both barrels. This is just a shortcut, I must tell you, because I couldn't excerpt this any better than I wrote it. A man named Jeff Lustig, who had been the organizer of the California Studies program, he was an amazing person. He also he'd done his research on Henry George, and I don't know how many people know about Henry George, but he was one of our first, the state's first philosophers. And he's the one who said in one sentence, "All wealth comes from the land." So Henry George was another kindred spirit of us land lovers. So Jeff Lustig first asked me to be part of this panel. The panel name was On the Ground in the 90s, or On the Ground in the 30s. Steinbeck, Steffens, Taylor, and McWilliams, and I was on part of the panel. So he asked me to be part of the panel as a kind of sit-in for Charles Wallenberg, who presented a paper on Paul Taylor with these other panelists in September. I wish I'd been there. Apparently the panel made such an impression on Jeff that he wanted to reproduce it for this conference, and I hope that what I have to say will be somewhere near the value for interaction that Charles' presentation did. Wallenberg's paper is the lead essay in a book of writings I'm editing with Bill Preston, a geographer at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. The book is an offshoot of a humanities project I've just completed on the subject of agriculture and the common good, which itself is a direct offshoot of having worked with Paul Taylor on reclamation law near the end of his life. Agriculture and the common good is what Taylor devoted his working life to. So when I met Chuck at an event in Merced and he confessed that he'd always wanted to write a paper about Paul Taylor's career, it was easy to ask him to pursue that dream, with the offer to publish it in this volume. And once it was written, it was not hard to find the place where it belonged, in the beginning, because for many of the authors, Paul is where it all began for us. It's a lovely essay. It usually makes me cry when I read it because it captures much of the essence of this man I loved. Wallenberg asks the question, was Paul Taylor the last Jeffersonian? And he leaves the reader feeling, probably not. But I can't leave it at that. Can't just leave it at who he was and why and what he did and what that accomplished. I also have to say what he meant and what his work means, present tense. I'm not a historian. I'm a lover and a fighter and a carrier of the baton. But it's also because for me, like Joe Hill, Paul didn't die. But most people don't have the faintest idea who Paul Taylor was, or at least they didn't before this conference and now this speaker series. So it's really the best place to start. Where most people start is that he was the husband of the woman that took this photograph, which is Migrant Mother, and many others in the 30s, Dorothea Lange. He wasn't just married to her, he was her partner. They came together as a couple because their work had merged, and the experience was something that they just couldn't say no to. Their one joint piece of published work is a book called An American Exodus, A Record of Human Erosion. I held that up for you already. Which to me displays the beauty and genius of two different minds working together. As a pair, they were ethnographers of an ecological disaster, deep social malaise, and human triumph. And they set an important stage that was not duplicated in those times. Some attention has been given recently to Marion Post Wolcott, another Farm Security Administration photographer, and her decision to quit documentary photography upon marrying, raising some relatively senseless talk, in my mind, about art versus love. As a field photographer myself, I can tell you what it means to work alone, and worse yet, to come home to an empty house, emotionally overburdened with nowhere to put it, and then take this nonverbal experience captured in two dimensions and try to communicate with it to a verbal world. Paul was the verbal interface for Dorothea's seeing. Dorothea brought the heart of Paul's message home. They were a team, and he was the husband of that team. There's a scene in a movie about Dorothea that was made just before her death. She's sitting in a chair going through stacks of photographs for her final exhibit, judging them harshly as only someone with Germanic genes can. Paul is standing behind her chair, looking over her shoulder, responding to her questions whether or not to kick each image out of the show. "What about this one?" she says. "No," he says. "What about this one?" "No." "This one?" "No." Paul was a husband. He was known primarily as an economist. He taught in the economics department at Berkeley from the time he got his PhD until he retired, with time out only for his several stints in government service, from the Farm Security Administration through the Department of the Interior to the Agency for International Development. He had some very famous students, Clark Kerr for once, but it was really his research in which he made his contributions. What he loved most was field research. In 1927, he got a Social Science Research Council grant to study Mexican labor in the United States. As Wallenberg tells it, rather than take the time to design a prior research plan, Taylor went out in the middle of it, stumbled into it. The result was a study still held in great esteem by historians and sociologists, if not by academic economists. Even at that time, his research was controversial among economists because of its narrative rather than statistical character. Taylor paraphrased his critics as saying, "You know, he goes out and talks to Mexican laborers and he puts down what they say. Why would anybody want to print what a Mexican laborer said?" Paul not only did research in a human way, he did research that would count and in a way that it would count. When he was hired by the California Emergency Relief Agency to study the problem of Dust Bowl immigrants who are pouring into the state, he asked to hire a photographer as part of the project. "What do you want a photographer for?" was the reply. So Dorothea was put on the payroll as a typist. When Taylor returned to the agency with his report, he had bound Dorothea's photographs into it and passed around the table. The result of that report was the establishment of the Federal Migrant Labor Camp Program. which produced the Wheat Patch Camp, in which Steinbrick's Joad family found solace and safety and community, and which still exists today. And after telling this story, Paul would smile gently and with no arrogance say, "And no one ever asked me why I wanted a photographer again." In the 40s, as the war began to remove the pain and displacement and poverty from farm labor, from the visible white workforce, which was, of course, replaced by invisible brown folks called braceros, Paul's research grew to questions of land tenure and certain aspects of water policy having to do with that, in other words, the acreage limitation and residency provisions of federal reclamation law. Most people who have looked at Taylor's life, including Wallenberg, see this as some kind of switch, a shift in focus from one thing, farm labor, to another, farm size, absentee land ownership, family farmers, and the like. To me, this view is more a reflection of a particularly Californian social schizophrenia, which cannot believe that any person could talk or worry about farm laborers and family farmers in one breath or brain space. But it is also a particularly American blindness to what is at stake in the question, who owns the land, and why every person doesn't have a right to some small piece of it. And whether the questions we now face having to do with homelessness and poverty and even racism, in fact, the collapse of the economy, of being on the ground in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, whether these problems don't actually have to do with the question of land. And I guess that's why I'm here today, to try to piece together the meaning of Paul Taylor, not just the last 40 years of his life spent on reclamation law, 2 of which I got to spend with him. And not just the glorious fieldwork days of the 30s when he and Dorothea trudged upstream through the current of landless people pouring into California, the 2 of them searching to the headwaters looking for the source. How could a man who had written down the words of farm workers then turn and write 25 law journal articles on the authority and the necessity of limiting the distribution of publicly subsidized irrigation water to the resident holders of land for no more than 160 acres? What could be the bridge between these 2 banks of a lifetime? One of the abutments of this bridge, I believe, were the words of a tenant farmer turned farm worker who had lost all his tools in the trek across the Dust Bowl of the Midwest, who, like the Joads, probably dreamed of finding a little place once they got out here, a little white house with maybe an orange tree and a place to plant flowers and vegetables, but who, when they got here, found they weren't even safe camping on a riverbank. This tenant farmer said to him, "If I could get me a piece of land, I'd work it with my hands." Land. The absolute one tool a farmer can't do without. The absolute one thing that distinguishes a small farmer from the farm worker, the access to land. Access to land is what his reclamation work was all about, protecting the one piece of foresightful legislation crafted in 1902, designed to guarantee that farmland in the West would not be monopolized through the monopolization of water, the one key resource necessary to make the land bloom. Legislation then recrafted and recrafted over the decades to its current degenerate state today. Only a shadow of the dream left. But still the shadow lurks, resides, and persists. And the shadow spirit lives in Paul's work. The other thing about Paul that provides the bridge between his 2 halves, not just the abutment, but probably also the superstructure, the cross members, and everything else, was his absolute and uncompromising respect of people as unique individuals and as members of one kind. He was gentle and relentless with everyone, from paupers to professors, bigoted farmers and mindless bureaucrats mouthing the myths of agribusiness to concerned citizens just learning about his field for the first time. I was planning in this part of the talk to read from his favorite piece of writing called Non-Statistical Notes from the Field, which was published in 1942 in the Department of Interior's journal Land Policy Review. It was also republished in the second edition of American Exodus. It was put out by the Oakland Museum, and I had forgotten that it was also republished, this favorite piece of Paul's. So it was republished in this book, On the Ground in the 30s, which is a collection of Paul's research papers, including the work he did with Clark Kerr on the cotton strike of 33. So it's an important book. But this Non-Statistical Notes from the Field is a beautiful, beautiful piece. And I was going to read the paragraphs because they demonstrate this thing about Paul's respect for people really beautifully. But then I realized that I had a few more stories to tell, and I thought I'll let you read those on your own. These are the things I need to tell you from my time with him. The first scene is in Sacramento, about 1978, in the large California Resources Agency hearing room on 9th Street. It is a hearing on the Westlands Water District and what we are to do about the monstrosity we've created there because of lack of enforcement of the acreage and residency provisions. The room is full of people, mostly in tailored three-piece suits, mostly lawyers and congressmen and people from the state's agribusiness superstructure. It is about 6 years before his death. I am a terrified 28-year-old sitting next to an old man in a rumpled coat with dandruff on the collar, his eyelids taped up with surgical tape because the muscles no longer work, sitting with a few sheets of typed yellow paper in his lap. When he walks up to the front of the room to give his testimony, it takes a while. People listen to him in the respectful silence given more because he is old than because they understand his greatness. When he is done, the hearing chairman thanks him for his presentation and then, duty-bound, says he must ask him a question, which is this: but if we were to enforce the acreage limitation in the Westlands Water District, how would we compensate all those landowners who would have to sell their land at pre-project prices? How would we compensate them for their enormous losses? Every breath of sound in the room died, and I can't breathe myself. And Paul said, how are you going to compensate all those people who have not been able to find land, to buy land, and become farmers? And then the room choked on its own stupid question. The last scene is one of those mundane things you only learn the magic of with the passage of some years. On one day in his office, on a late stuffy afternoon, as we worked over a paragraph in need of perfection, Paul looked up from his pen and his paper and he said across the desk to me, it all comes down to what kind of society do you want to live with? He had, as he used to say, put it in a nutshell for me. And at that moment, everything changed. More than 10 years have passed. That's what I said 20 years ago. It's way more than 30 years now. More than 30 years have passed, and I can still hear his voice and see the gentle, pleased openness of his face that was his equivalent of triumph. Revelation at last, the whole bag of concerns that we carried together cinched up in a sentence. What kind of society do you want to live in? That's what it still all comes down to for me. I don't think Paul thought of himself as a writer, even though his articles are both numerous in content, numerous and significant in content. I know that he considered himself both an economist and an academic, although he didn't accept others' definitions of those terms, which would have made him far less than he was. I think he was a worker, in the sense that he had skills and energy and felt he should use them on behalf of the world as long and as well as he could. I now also think of him as a keeper, a term that came up the year before in one of the California Studies forums on public life. There, after listening to State Assemblyman Phil Eisenberg describe Martin Luther King's committed leadership as a sort of unavoidable response to the needs of the movement and the day, Pastor Curtis Mitchell of the Antioch Progressive Baptist Church replied with the controlled passion of a true man of God, Martin was a keeper of the dream for civil rights. And being the keeper, he was marching to the drumbeat of a major he could not let loose of. He was the active leader of that movement because of that drumbeat. Well, Paul was a keeper of the dream that dreamed Jefferson. Human equality maintained through democracy. Democracy maintainable only so long as the resources of the country are evenly distributed. Paul's loyalty wasn't to Jefferson or to the lovely, slightly nostalgic abstraction we have made of Jeffersonian democracy. His loyalty was to the hard and unpopular reality of it. In fact, his loyalty was to us, to every person who shared the planet with him when he was here, and to all of us who would remain afterward. He made no separation between himself and the world, and that, especially in this day and age, is what made him a great man. I confess, he was my hero, and he is my model of how we should be in the world, here, now, as academics, as scholars, as bureaucrats, as citizens. It was being on the ground in the 30s that gave him the rest of his life and gave us the legacy of his work. That his work came out of an undivided life is a revolutionary message in my mind and a signpost. It requests the kind of revolution that comes out of dreams, or maybe visions is a better word for it. A revolution that takes place in the blink of an eye, in the change of a heart, the change from which all else follows. Some lines from an old Joan Baez song have been following me around for the last few days as I've been preparing to come to this conference. Actually, different songs have been following me around the last few days, but you'll hear those later. But these Joan Baez words were more like being pushed around by a janitor with a big broom, sweeping me from corner to corner. And I'm afraid I'm going to sing to you, like I did the year before. Paul would not have sung to you, but each of us has to do this in our own way. The name of the song is Ghetto. It's from her album One Day at a Time, and it's the last verse that particularly applies. And if there's such a thing as revolution, and there will be if we rise to the call, and when we build, when we build the new Jerusalem, there won't be no more ghetto, no ghetto at all. There won't be no more ghetto. Hold that thought. So that's what I told him as I dove off the edge of the cliff, going back to the pointless forest where I came from. I want to tell you one more story about my time with Paul, and it's about that paragraph in Need of Perfection. Paul Wallace Gates, the Cornell historian who'd written about the Spanish land grants in California and how they left the legacy of large land ownerships to us from the get-go, Paul Wallace Gates had arranged for Paul Schuster Taylor's Law Journal articles on reclamation law to be published as a book by Arno Press. Paul had had to write an introduction to these articles, and I was standing by to help. Actually, I was sitting across the desk from him in his Morris chair, the one where he regularly took his post-lunch nap. He had a few sheets of unlined paper on his desk, and he was sitting with the pen poised over them, and he looked up on the bookshelves behind me that lined the entire wall. And these are the shelves where Ernesto Galarza's book, Merchants of Labor, sat, Elias Toomas's 26 Centuries of Land Reform, and Wendell Berry's new book, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture, which Paul really admired, and hundreds of other books that are documenting the social and economic phenomena relevant to his issue. His eyes scanned the shelves, and he said, "Where's my Bible?" And I got up to help him look, and having no idea why he'd want one, deciding it must be at home, he gave up and we quit for the day. The next day he came to the office with a 2x2 yellow post-it note on which he'd written Isaiah 5:8. "Woe unto them that join house to house, that lay field to field, that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth." He had to translate that for me because I didn't understand the laying thing, or even that the Bible could contain a sentiment about concentration of land ownership. He then selected 2 more quotes from Reclamation history, and we then proceeded to write that first paragraph, which took 3 days. And I have to tell you that I learned to be patient with words from him. Here's that perfect paragraph. And I read this in part for the Reedley Peace Center people in particular. "Search for a congenial or at least tolerable relation between man and land has gone on throughout recorded time, for that relation largely shapes the relationship of man to man. Societies can become homogeneous or polarized depending on whether land ownership is distributed widely among the many or concentrated in the hands of a few. Throughout time, wide distribution has brought stability, while sustained concentration has jeopardized the peace and fed the forces of revolt and revolution. Our 20th century is no exception. On the contrary, it has witnessed the largest and most pervasive revolutions of all history in Europe, in Latin America, and in Asia." We could talk another time more about Paul's understanding of the role of land tenure in war, and I think it's an important thing to pursue. I want to talk a little bit now about my contributions to the research on land distribution and community development. It was after I'd finally got it about Arvin and Dinuba, after it finally clicked into place that small farms made better towns than large-scale absentee farms did. We were at a hearing on Westlands here in Fresno in the new Civic Auditorium then. It was 1977 in the summer, and it's before the hearing that I mentioned in my talk. Martha Chase, Paul's research assistant, who was a law student at Berkeley, drove us down in Paul's VW Bug with me in the back seat. George Ballas was there in his pinstriped overalls, I think. I don't think there was any hay sticking out anywhere, although there could have been. He was a hair theatrical when it came to hearings. It was my first sighting of George, and also of John Harris and his family, who sat in folding chairs directly in front of us, occasionally hooting at the speakers from the opposition. It was also my first sighting of Willoughby Houck, who farmed 2,000 acres in Firebaugh and had come to testify in favor of the 160-acre limit. I later came to know and love Willoughby as the leader of the California branch of the American agriculture movement. As I sat there in the folding chairs, a little bewildered, listening to the testimonies for and against enforcing the limit, it came to me. If people could just see the differences between the two towns, it would be a whole nother ballgame. The Arvin Dinuba study was always presented numerically. 60% greater this, 49% greater that, 15% less one indicator of well-being. A tedious list of quantitative facts that were supposed to add up to one community being better than the other. No photos were ever presented. And when I finally looked at the book, as you saw, there were so few pictures as to cause doubt about the truthfulness of the portrait they were painting. But I was sure the differences they documented in numbers would be visible from the street, even never having been to either town. All the numbers numb people, I thought, they need to see. Still, it took me time to activate the idea. Then one September in 1981, my mother wanted to go visit my brother for his birthday, and he was in Tehachapi doing a little time. And when I looked at the map, I saw that the name Arvin was nearby. And as we entered Kern County, I convinced her that we should take a little side trip, which we did, and I shot 2 rolls of film on the fly. The next day, as we were making our way home from this visit, I pulled over to the side of the Stockdale Highway as we headed for I-5, and I said, "I'm sorry, but I have to go to Danuba." "Okay," she said, even though she had to be back to work Monday morning. So we stayed overnight in Visalia and took in a movie and shot 2 more rolls of film in Danuba on a Sunday afternoon. After trying to make a case for the differences with the photos I had, the next year I went back with 40 rolls of film and base maps, and I spent 6 days visually and graphically documenting both these business districts and every school, church, park, and neighborhood in the 2 towns. I spent the next 2 years printing and analyzing my visual graphic data, and then organized it into my master's thesis in environmental planning. When I took the draft back to my committee chairman, he told me 2 quite devastating things. 1, the 2 towns didn't look any different to him. And 2, I was gonna have to analyze the current farm size land ownership patterns if I expected anyone to believe there was still a connection. So I'll leave out all the other reasons why people questioned the wisdom of doing what I was doing, except for this one. An alternative explanation for why Danuba was a better community than Arvin, this was offered to me, is that Danuba has a lot of Mennonites. When I asked why that may be a factor, because I'm still ignorant, right? The person said, "Well, they're so clean." So I just thought you should know that. You have a reputation to uphold. And it could be the people, is what these people were saying. It could be the people that make the towns different. So needing to get the land ownership data is what led me to pack up my life, leave my 4-bedroom home and mate in Long Island. I forgot to tell you I was there. And I moved to Davis to work with Dean McCannell at the Macrosocial Accounting Project. It was one way, I needed his data. So I was also aware that Davis was home to the California Institute for Rural Studies, and the combination seemed like the greatest likelihood of finding a home for myself and my work. I found a little one-room shack on the plains of Dixon, about 7 miles west of Davis, and I squatted there while I collected data and aggregated and made good numerical variables for the comparison. And as I did, what emerged was an understanding of how the farm size affected the development of the towns. And it's that it determines the occupational structure. It's what social scientists call the occupational structure of the towns. In Goldschmidt's time, over 1/2 of Danuba's breadwinners were independently employed businessmen, white-collar employees, or farmers. In Arvin, only 1/5 of its workforce fell into that category. 2/3 of Arvin's working population were farm workers, compared to less than 1/3 of Danuba's. And the difference directly affected the social structure and the income distribution of each community, and it was the direct result of the difference in farm size. When I finally got decent social data for the towns, for my 2 towns, 30 years after Goldschmidt had collected his, it appeared that the differences in occupational structure had increased. But other things had changed too. The dollar value of ag products from Arvin's land base, which at the time of Goldschmidt's study, the dollar value had been equal. The dollar value of ag products between the 2 towns was equal. The dollar value of Arvin's land base, when I came back, was much greater than it had been. It was much greater than Danuba's dollar value of ag products from its land base. But Danuba's population had grown. It was now about 25% larger than Arvin's. And people had said to me, well, you can't compare the two townhouses because Danube grew. I said, well, isn't that maybe a consequence of this farm size pattern? I don't know, call me crazy, but you know. The debates about whether or not the study was valid continued ad nauseum. The discovery of the importance of the occupational structure phenomenon, however, led me to develop a variable for Dean's macrosocial studies. His database had been hampered somewhat by having the land ownership data come from a different data source than his social data. His social data came from the census of not census of agriculture, came from the census of population and housing. Whereas his land ownership data came from things that he had collected with Jerry White. Jerry White had done a huge amount of ponderous mapping of farm size, and they were using that data, but it didn't come from the same place as the census data. So I found a way to make a variable that took the households with income from farm self-employment and made a ratio out of it with all of the total number of people employed in agriculture. So it wasn't a direct number, it was a ratio. So the higher number of farmers, meaning households with farm self-employment, that became his variable for farm size. And that made his regression analyses go almost in a straight line. So that was part of what helped him get to the point where he could say, the science is done. Okay. And in the meantime, I recognized that the attacks were never going to stop. The attacks, you could prove that thing scientifically to every social scientist in the world, and the people out here would still say, oh no, it's probably not, it could be something else, you know, it's probably crazy data. Maybe they didn't consider the oil production, or, you know, it was never going to stop. So I recognized that the public was still ignorant of this research. The social scientists could talk to the legislators, but the people still had no idea what this was all about. And especially thanks to my work with the American Ag Movement people, I really found myself being pulled more and more towards public education and away from research. So, I don't mean to harp on this, but it was another act of grace that got me into CIRS. One of those American Ag Movement farmers, a guy named Alvin Reese up in Orland in the Sacramento Valley, he found a little card one day, and it was he wanted me to write grants and get some funding for the work we were all doing, and he said, Trudy, you should go for this. And what it was a little card from the California Council for the Humanities, and they had a call for proposals on a subject called the economy and the common good. And I said, oh, Alvin, those people aren't going to see the connection to what we're doing. And so we let it go that year. But the next year he found another little card. And this one was the funding project was for the environment and the common good. And he wanted me to try. And I said, oh, Alvin, these guys aren't going to see how we're connected to the environment. And Alvin says, gee, you'd think they could see that agriculture is where the economy and the environment come together. And he had me. And so I submitted a proposal to the council, and not under their funding category. I submitted under my own funding category, agriculture and the common good, and they bought it. CRS, Don Villarejo's group, sponsored the project, which we called Seeing the Invisible, Mega Farms in the Rural Communities of California, and it received the biggest amount they'd ever given at that time. We got $60,000 to go around the valley, taking a photo exhibit of farm worker conditions by Iowa photographer Bill Gillette, setting it up in public places and organizing events around it like poetry readings or attaching the exhibit to festivals that were ongoing anyway. And we had a vague promise to hold town hall meetings too, which I never got around to. We promised them the moon, and I lassoed about a quarter of it. Extended the project from 12 to 18 months, during which time I drove my 1974 Datsun station wagon up and down Highway 99 filled to the brim with exhibit materials, meeting people and learning just how hard it is to talk about this subject here. For one example, one afternoon I was meeting with Gail Cerebian, who was then the director of the King's Tulare Arts Council at the time, and her assistant, Susie Pogue, who informed me she was a real Pogue. She's from the Pogues, which is a Tulare County big ranching family, which I didn't know. We were in the Farm Bureau office in Visalia and trying to work out details for an exhibit in Hanford. And I just happened to use the B word, meaning Boswell. And Gail took one look at Susie, and Susie jumped up from her chair and made a phone call, and my Hanford exhibit was canceled. Ouch, yep. And a similar thing happened in Merced with Joan Sortini, the director of the Arts Council there, and I learned to be a little more careful with what I said, but, and I didn't even try to set up something in Bakersfield. I mean, I'd get killed. I'm sure I'd get killed. But one thing that was clear from doing this project for 18 months was that being an outsider was a huge handicap. It was really hard to come into somebody's office and say, "Where are you from?" "Well, I'm from Davis." "Oh yeah, sure, we want you here." "You're right. Get out, 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 out." So I know that was a big part of my decision to move to Tulare County, which I did in mid-1993, hoping to become a resident, at least if not an insider, and to become finally a person attached to this place, to become one of its people. One of the projects that came to me while I was still in Davis, working on that grant, is one other thing that caused a tremendous shift. Thank you. And it was something called the Forum on Church and Land. While I was there at my desk in Davis one day, this guy named John Pitney from Corvallis, Oregon called. He's a Methodist minister who grew up as a dairy kid, and he wanted some help from organizing a conference that he called the Forum on Church and Land, and he was from something called the Western Small Farm and Church Center in Filer, Idaho. So I'm still an agnostic, and I was sort of put off by the church part, but the word land got my attention. And I tell him I'm funded for this project on agriculture and the common good. And he says, "Well, that's sort of what we're working on too." And so I say, "Okay, what do we got to do?" And he says, "Well, I really need some contacts." And so I asked Don Virejo, who has tons of contacts up the wazoo. And we get him a list, which includes Paul Buxman. And I know that Paul and Ruth probably put John Pitney up for at least twice during his attempt to rally Californians around this idea of having a forum on what the church might be involved in land issues. So we spent 16 months in the planning process, because it isn't easy to get people, when you're an outsider, it isn't easy to get people from the inside to come along. And John wanted to call the forum "Who Owns the Land?", with the implication being, of course, that God owns the land. But that was just a little too hot a title for this place, and so it eventually ended up being "Who is my neighbor? Agriculture, the common good, and the role of the church in truth-telling and reconciliation." And during the forum itself, I managed to hold myself away from all the church part, like the workshops on church efforts and the Bible study and the Old Testament prophets by Marvin Cheney from San Francisco Theological Union, and instead I focused on my all-important contribution, which means a deranged talk on the Arvin study and a day-long trip from Selma to Erlenmark, where we will meet with some of the cancer cluster families. And despite my attempt to stay safe, by the end I've had what can only be called a conversion experience, primarily from being with all the wonderful people who attended the conference, which were mostly from the Midwest. Very few Californians found themselves wanting to come to this. But after the conference, for two good solid months, I was completely stilled in my work. I know that the need to begin discovering how faith was intertwined with the land was another reason for leaving academia to make space for this other element. So what now? So I'm going to spare you a lot of the agonies of learning the rules of neighborliness in this place. I should have remembered to talk about selling Fred Smith's Ruby Reds, because we had that was one of the best things I ever did in this whole valley. When Fred had raisins, he couldn't hawk except in little tiny bags that he and his wife were putting up like crazy, trying to sell at farmers markets. And I heard about it probably from Paul, the great disseminator. And I started selling 25-pound bags. I'd bag them up in 2-pound bags, and we'd sell them through the church. One day my pastor was gone, and I saw my chance. I said, okay, I got the microphone, and I said, we're going to adopt a raisin farmer. And they said, what is she doing now? I said, no, really, you're going to love this. And they did. They loved those raisins. The most amazing thing about the whole project was opening the box of raisins for people who don't do raisins. And you pull back that plastic bag, and the whiff of this perfect smell of raisins comes out. It blows people away. So I'm sorry, those of you who missed the Fred Smith's Ruby Reds project. I'm really sorry we didn't get to your doorstep, but that was one of the best things that we did here. But I'm now going to talk about 4 things that I've kind of arranged for the future. The first thing is a book that started with the Humanities Project, and it's called A Little Piece of Land, Writings on California and the Common Good in California. Writings on Agriculture and the Common Good in California. This is a 25-year-old project that's about to come to fruition. Mark Eriks is going to publish it. A lot of people didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but Mark wants to put it out there. And I'm about finished compiling the thing. So by next year we should have it. It has sections on social science. I've kind of kept it set in separate sections by discipline. I've a first section on Paul Taylor, because except for you people, nobody else knows about him. And then I have a section on the social science that's been done on land and social factors. Don Villarejo has a piece in it. He sells pieces in the other one. Don and Dean have pieces in that section. Also, Merrill Goodall, who did he was a political scientist at Claremont. He did the research on the democratic structure of irrigation districts that Isao was pointing to last week, when we talked about some districts are democratic, one person will vote, some districts are by land or by property value. Well, Merrill Goodall did that research, and he was a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful man. So we have Merrill's paper in there, which is good, because he got killed on his bicycle when going down to Rite Aid for an ice cream cone. It was a terrible thing. So there's that social science section. Then there's a humanities section, which I put the philosophers and the theologians. Elmer Martins, who died just a few weeks ago, I have a paper from Elmer about land theology in that section. We have Father Bill Wood's keynote address from the Focal Conference. Father Bill Wood was the head of the Rural Catholic Life Conference for a long time. He was just an amazing human being. So we've got those papers. We've got a section of the journalists and historians telling the stories, detail by detail, about the Army Corps of Engineer dams. We got water, we got land, we got all kinds of journalist stories about Westlands. So that's a really good section. And then we have what I call the endangered species, which is writings from the people of the valley, including Fred. I just got 2 of Fred's pieces. Some wonderful poems, and I want to read you one of the poems. A lot of people think that the poems and the social science don't belong together, but I think that the poetry allows people to understand why we should care, and it may allow some people to have an entry point into some of this more academic work, and it may cause people to want to read it. So this poem is by John Castine. It's called Valley Planting. And it came to me in the night that I had to read this to you, so here we go. We thought she'd lose her mind when she dropped her baby in the stubbled fields at harvest time. But with words and broths, we urged her on to stride the friant winter cold and lean against the wind, the fence posts, wires askew, arms awry like lonely Christs supplicating for fallow fields, until spring planting took her in. So I hope that this volume of writings will become a resource to us in whatever part of this work any of you want to pick up. The second thing is a nonprofit that I've been calling New Leaf. LEAF stands for Land Educational Arts Forum. I've had all kinds of different ideas for a nonprofit since I've needed an institutional home since I moved down here. But this one seems to be sticking with me. And the idea for New Leaf, as in turning over a new leaf, came to me from a quote by Barry Lopez in his book, Rediscovery of North America, about the travesty and the onset of European culture, 500 years of European culture on the North American continent. After laying out the horrendous events caused by Columbus's landing, he says, "What Columbus began then is not isolated in the past. We see a continuance in the present of this brutal, avaricious behavior, a profound abuse of the place during the course of centuries of demand for material wealth. We need only look for verification at the acid-burned forests of New Hampshire, at the cauterized soils of Iowa, or at the collapse of the San Joaquin Valley into caverns emptied of their fossil waters. The point I wish to make is that this violent corruption needn't define us. Looking back on that Spanish incursion, we can take the measure of the horror and assert that we will not be bound by it. We can say, yes, this happened and we are ashamed, but 500 years later, we intend to mean something else in the world. So New Leaf is my vehicle to try to mean something else in this valley with regard to land. The third thing is John Pitney's music. Now, I've told you a little bit about John. It was John's songs that really hooked me and were part of the conversion tool, the effect that caused the conversion. Once I started listening to the songs, I was hooked. Eventually, I had 2 cassettes of his music, and I listened to him up and down the valley forever, while I was looking for a new home. And that music cemented what I tried not to learn at the conference. John has 3 albums with 4 CDs, plus 2 songbooks that include, these are songbooks, and they include study sessions on everything from land theology to recycling and living simply. His songs break down into 3 interesting categories. They are those aimed at farmers, both soulless and challenging. There are those aimed at our consumer economy and culture, and those directed toward people in the church to follow its teachings more fully, or to remember the role of faith in the struggle. I was going to give you some examples of each, but I'm a little rusty on my auto harp, and I decided to save us all from embarrassment. So I would be grateful, however, to work with anybody who wants some interest in using music in working as a means of working for change. As Joe Hill, the labor organizer, once wrote, and in fact from his jail cell in Salt Lake City, where he would be executed from, a pamphlet, no matter how good, is never read more than once, but a song is learned by heart and repeated over and over. And I maintain that if a person can put a few cold, common-sense facts into a song and dress them up in a cloak of humor to take the dryness off of them, he will succeed in reaching a great number of workers who are too unintelligent or too indifferent to read a pamphlet or an editorial on economic science. So there's Joe Hill's word on songs as an organizing tool for you. The last thing is what I want to call FOC California, the Forum on Church and Land in California. I think it's time to hold another forum on church and land, perhaps even to make an organization that exists through time. I have asked some of the participants from the first Forum on Church and Land what they thought about this idea, and I was astounded to find that they were also stilled by the experience of the first one, and that they were very excited about the thought we might do it again. One of them was a Methodist pastor from Livingston named Bill Ruth. His church has been running a farm labor effort called Casa de la Dignidad for over 20 years. And he was an amazing person to meet and get to know. Bill was very excited about that dude over again. And Marvin Chaney, the Old Testament theologian who ran the Bible study, says, let's do it. And he's now gone, in his research over the last 20 years, he's now even more certain that the land concentration that Isaiah and the other prophets, Jeremiah, were talking about, they were actually talking about land concentration that was driving the peasants into the hills, and that the situation that Isaiah and the other prophets were standing up and screaming their heads off about is not so different from what we've got here. So I'm sure that we have the resources we would need to begin to coalesce people of faith around the issue of land. And in addition, I think God has given us an issue that could bring people together over the divides we know exist among us, and that's groundwater. I knew when the drought grew serious that it was time to get people to talk about the issues it raises, like who should get water when it's in short supply, especially from federal reclamation projects that were built to support the small family farmers. But the continuing drought, which has triggered the disastrous increase in drilling and overpumping of the aquifers, I think this issue has organizing power. Paul Taylor knew that the acreage limitation would never be enforceable so long as groundwater pumping remained unregulated, though he kept that fact to himself. The need to protect the public interest in our aquifers cuts across many lines, and it may be the issue we need to unify the small farmers and the real residents of this place against the large absentee owners who have the capability of taking the groundwater all for themselves. So what does it come down to? That we need to stand toe to toe with them and say, no, you can't have any more. You have enough. In fact, you over there, you have too much, and you need to give it back for the sake of your neighbors and the country as a whole. You need to share. That's what we need to tell them, standing toe to toe, head to head. God willing, and the creeks don't rise, we can do it.